Hello, my name is Casey Gerken, and I am the owner of Innisfree Bookshop in Meredith, New Hampshire, in the Lakes region, right in the middle. And it is my pleasure this evening to introduce to you Jennifer Haigh. She is the author of 4 acclaimed novels and a book of short stories. Her books have won the Penn Hemingway Award, the Massachusetts Book Award, and the Penn New England Award in Fiction, and have been published in 18 languages. She is a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and won a Literature Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. And her new novel, Mercy Street, released on February 1st, 2022. And before she joins us, I'm really sorry, but I forgot to just give a few tips for tonight. There is the Q&A tool at the bottom for attendees, or maybe at the top of your screen for attendees to ask live questions. The event is being recorded and will be distributed post-event. And I think that's all I need to say to get the Zoom call kicked off. And I now would like to welcome Jennifer Haigh. Please help me welcome her to the call. It's nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to be involved in this conversation with you. I just actually, I'll admit, just finished Mercy Street today. It was interesting. I started it in January when we were having snowstorm after snowstorm after snowstorm here. And I finished it today when things, at least up in New Hampshire, are melting away. So it seemed to correspond pretty well with how the book started and how the book ended. And I very much enjoyed it. I maybe to kick everything off, one thing that I was struck by when I was reading Mercy Street was the depth of the character development. I felt like you had maybe been living with these characters for a very long time before they managed to make the page. And so I think just to kick off the discussion, I wondered, how long have you been thinking about Mercy Street? How long have you been working on this book?
So I finished the book right about a year ago, and I started it in 2016. It's tellingly, this is a book that was written almost entirely during the Trump presidency. It was also written in the aftermath of the snowpocalypse here in Boston, and you really see that in the novel, of course. The story opens in February 2015, just as the snow is starting, and basically ends when the snow stops. So like anybody who lived in New England at that time, I have PTSD from that winter. It is still so vivid to me. And that was, very much part of the spark that started me writing the story. Unlike anything else I've written, Mercy Street really comes from my own experience. Every novel comes about differently. And this one I sort of backed into. I had been volunteering for some time at a women's clinic that did general health care, contraception, but also abortions. I had done this work, not with any intention of writing about it. I started doing it because I really believed in what this clinic was doing. But after I'd been doing it for some while, I kind of felt that I needed to write about it. And so it really caught me by surprise. In the past, novels have come about because of the landscape, because of the place. And this one really came out of that personal experience of volunteering at that clinic.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because one of the pre-submitted comments was, it's not a question, it's a comment, but it was from Nancy Connery. And she mentioned that she and her partner had been volunteer escorts at a Planned Parenthood in Boston. And they were doing that volunteer work, I guess, after the 35-foot buffer zone was struck down by the Supreme Court. So maybe in a very similar time frame as your volunteer work, right? And they recognized that you totally captured what it was like on the sidewalk outside of the Planned Parenthood. And obviously now we know why, because you were there and you knew what was going on there.
Yeah, that feeling of coming to the clinic and walking past this gauntlet of protesters, it's very much, part of the reason I started writing this book. For the character in this book, Claudia, the counselor in this clinic, it is a daily occurrence to just show up to work and have to deal with these protesters who are sometimes angry and sometimes get in her face. And it's an experience that becomes routine for her, but it never really becomes normal. And that's part of what I wanted to convey in the novel, what it is like to encounter so much resistance just in the process of doing your work. In fact, the first scene in the book where Claudia is looking out the window on Ash Wednesday, counting the protesters on the sidewalk, that was actually the first scene I wrote when I sat down to write this novel. That never happens. And usually you write things all out of order and you don't find the opening chapter until you've gone through the story once. But in this case, that really is where I started writing. I think it's significant.
So it's interesting to me that you're writing from such a personal experience that's very similar to Claudia's, like you said, but you're also able to inhabit Anthony's character in kind of an empathetic way. Maybe I feel like he is sort of a lost soul in all of this. I mean, he makes some choices that are certainly questionable, but he kind of I feel like you were able to write that character with some empathy in terms of all of the things that were going on in his life. And I wonder how were you able to do that? That seems, now that I know that you had that personal experience as well, it seems even more incredible that character was developed so thoroughly.
Well, thank you for saying that, Casey. In writing fiction, that's the whole game. It's all about empathy. It's this kind of exercise in extreme empathy, getting inside somebody else's head. I think of being a novelist as kind of like being an actor. You're really trying to inhabit each of these characters, whether or not you share their beliefs about things, whether or not you share their worldview. It's what actors do. You don't judge your character, you become your character. And in writing Mercy Street, I had to do that with all of them, not just with Anthony, but with Timmy, with Victor Prine, guys whose beliefs are very different from mine. But it's, the process is the same, whether the character is similar to you or not. It's still, you're trying to write that character the way he himself would describe himself. So in writing Victor Prine, I'm presenting him as he would present himself. It's the way he sees himself. And so as the writer, you kind of have to do that without judgment. And in the time when you're writing that character, you have to take that character's side, even if he holds beliefs that you find repugnant, you still have to do it. That's part of your job as the author.
Yeah, it was amazing the way that you did that with Victor as well. And it's interesting that you mentioned about doing it without judgment, because I was reading the review in the New York Times Book Review, and I thought it was interesting that the characters, or your ability to write the two, what were referred to as the two main male characters, as Victor and Anthony, but there really wasn't that much mention of Timmy. And I kind of feel like he was the glue of the whole thing. Like he was this person that was sort of in the middle of it all, who didn't really judge anybody for anything that they were doing. And they all kind of all the stories sort of connected in one way or another back to him and what he was doing, all the way to the end. And so I was just curious what your thoughts were about that character, because he was somebody who, was a little bit like Switzerland, right? He was just there doing his thing, and he seemed very simple, but I think he was not at all. I think he was pretty complex.
I think none of these people are simple. In fact, I have great affection for Timmy. So Timmy is Claudia's weed dealer. Those who've read the book will remember this. And he functions as sort of a first responder in her life. She is a woman who works in this pressure cooker environment, this atmosphere of the clinic that can be very isolating, in fact. And one thing I'm struck by, looking at the novel from some distance now, having finished it a year ago, is that it's about lonely people. These four characters are all extremely isolated people. And that's as true of Claudia as it is of the men. In many ways, Timmy is the person she is closest to. She's the person she has the kind of unguarded conversations with. She sees him every couple of months. She goes to his apartment and buys weed, and they watch TV and you watch car shows. And some of the most enjoyable scenes to write in the book were those scenes with Claudia and Timmy. And it was like this rare moment in Claudia's life where she can relax and really connect with another person. And I think that has everything to do with who Timmy is. He's a lovable guy.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like he was sort of Anthony's first responder as well, right? Like the first place he went, whenever he needed something was to text his full name, right? As if Timmy didn't know his full name, to let him know that he was on the way. You mentioned the isolation of the characters, and I wondered, just based on when you started the novel and when you finished it, so it's kind of a pre and post pandemic thing, and I wonder if everything that we all, because there were times where I was reading, and of course, a year of epic snowstorms can feel as isolating as a year of pandemic, right? And I wondered if kind of finishing the novel or writing the novel through that experience changed the characters at all. I mean, even a little bit, like, were you able to maybe connect a little bit more with that feeling of isolation, just because that's the space that we were all in universally? I think maybe that's what I'm getting at, right? I was really impressed by the fact that I'm a transplant to New England, right? So I was really happy. I've been here long enough that I really understood and recognized a lot of the places that you talked about, but then realized that the stories are really very universal. Like, they don't, New England is a very big part of the story, but at the same time, it's so much bigger than just the story that happens in New England. And so I just wondered, like, writing through the pandemic, does that sort of help you to everybody in the country is going through this thing where we're kind of in lockdown, right? And, did that ever inform any of the writing as you were going, like, maybe not directly or literally, but that feeling that now we're all sharing of, being locked away, maybe help to, or inform in any way the character development there?
No, I mean, I don't think it really had an effect. This is maybe not widely known, but for a lot of writers, the pandemic didn't change life very much. It's sort of how we function anyway. You live at home, you work at home, you kind of spend most of the day with your imaginary friends. And in a way, the pandemic made me feel like everybody's a novelist now. Everybody is working in solitary confinement with no human contact, as I have been doing for these many years now.
Sure.
So yeah, of course, the pandemic is, it's affected us profoundly, but in terms of the day-to-day, for me, it's actually been like this for a really long time.
Yeah. So we actually have a question in the Q&A. By the way, if you're asking questions in the Q&A and you'd like to let us know who you are and where you're from, please feel free to do that. This particular question is from an anonymous attendee, and they want to know, they are curious about Victor's beliefs. How did you learn how white supremacy and misogynistic beliefs lead to such anti-abortion activities? It was something that was quite foreign to this person who's asking the question.
Yeah, I love that question. Well, when in the kind of early stages of writing the novel, I knew that there would need to be an antagonist to Claudia. And, because of where and how I grew up, I've known lots and lots of people who were vehemently opposed to abortion. I grew up in Northern Appalachia, Western Pennsylvania. I went to 12 years of Catholic school. I was one of those kids who has heard that abortion is bad even before I understand how you get pregnant. So the first 18 years of my life, I was surrounded by people who felt very strongly that abortion was wrong. I was also surrounded by a lot of pro-choice people. I just didn't know it because those were beliefs that nobody could talk about in the community I grew up in. It was a really kind of socially conservative place. Not coincidentally, it is the part of the world that Victor Prime comes from. So when I set out to write this antagonist to Claudia, it was very natural for me to make him come from the place I came from. It's a place I knew well. I will say that most of the people I know back there are opposed to abortion for religious reasons. Interestingly, that's not the case with Victor Prine. He's not religious at all. He's an atheist. His reasons for opposing abortion are, a lot darker and a lot creepier. He's a racist, and he's not opposed to abortion in all cases. He's just opposed to white women having abortions. His real concern is that as a white person, he's becoming part of a minority group, and that he feels that the country has changed in ways that he's not prepared for, and he thinks abortion is part of the problem. And if white women would just stop having abortions, then you could get the numbers back up, and white people would no longer be an endangered species. That's how Victor sees it. It's a really warped way of looking at the world, but it's a way of thinking that I became familiar with in some of these online communities. I spent some time on 4chan, on 8chan. Wow, there's some really ominous people out there in the world. And, it certainly would have been possible to make Claudia's antagonist a religious person, but in a way, this is more complex. And I think it is important. It cuts to the heart of a lot of opposition to abortion that is really about controlling women and controlling society. And Victor Prine is a person who feels he has very little control in his own life. And kind of this is his way of feeling like he's making a difference. He wants to do something about abortion.
Right. Here we have another anonymous question. So many of the characters seem damaged from the hardship that can come from a single parent home. Why did you choose to have Claudia keep the pregnancy, even though it would only continue the cycle of a single parent home?
Well, I personally don't believe that it's necessarily a bad thing to be from a single parent home. For Claudia, it's completely natural because she's never lived in any other kind of arrangement. And so, I hate to talk about the ending of the book too much because it's a total spoiler, but I assume that the people who are joining us have read the book, I guess. For her, it is a completely natural choice to make. Anthony did not grow up in a single parent home. Timmy did not grow up in a single parent home. So, some of the characters did, some of the characters didn't. Claudia's background it's really central to who she is. So her work as a counselor in this clinic, it's very much informed by this experience of where and how she grew up. Her mother was a very young single mother who dropped out of high school to have her child. When Claudia was growing up, to make ends meet, they took in foster children, sometimes several foster children. And this completely shapes Claudia's ideas about what family is, about what parenthood is, and also what lives are like for kids who are not necessarily born into great circumstances. So it has everything to do with how she ended up doing the work she does in life. None of it is random.
So I have a couple of questions too when I get back to Timmy. I think Timmy might be one of my favorites as well as a character. There's a question that audience member wants to know, which came first, Claudia's smoking weed or the Timmy character? So was Timmy first and then Claudia went to smoke with him, or did you know that she was going to have a habit and you needed a dealer?
Well, Claudia was the first character I wrote, so everything arose out of that. So there was a Claudia before there was a Timmy, no question. But these questions are always hard to answer because when you're writing a novel, you live with it for so long that it's hard to remember how anything started. You live with these characters for so long that they seem as real to you as anybody you've ever met in your real life. And so now talking about Claudia and Timmy and Anthony, I do not feel like I created them. I feel like they just exist in the world and I just reported it. And of course, that's completely untrue. They completely came out of my imagination. But it's this kind of elaborate form of mental illness that leads a person to write fiction, how you can really talk yourself into a world that you create. And that's what makes it possible to write a novel.
So Nancy Connery she's from Canton. She was the reader who had the comment that we talked about at the top, who also volunteered at the Planned Parenthood. And she has a question. Was Claudia so drawn and comfortable with Timmy because he reminded her of her life with her mom, the grubby surroundings, eating junky food on the couch? Or did Timmy give her the acceptance she craved from her mom?
Oh, I don't think it's about acceptance at all. I think it's more the former. It's that Claudia and Timmy sort of recognize each other. And it's almost a sibling kind of connection in some ways. I think she feels like she's known him her entire life. And she can very easily place him in her childhood. You know, she can imagine Timmy as a kid being one of the foster kids that she grew up with, that there is some deep commonality between the two of them. And I think that's really the root of their bond.
So you talked about I think I love that you called it a mental illness that allows you to write fiction like this, but it is very incredible how well developed all the characters are. And it's not just the characters and their immediate story, but their backstories. Like, I mean, it's what, 200 or 300 pages or so, but it felt like a saga sometimes because we were spanning so many decades with all of these character stories and everything. And I just wonder, does that always part and parcel? I mean, if you have a lot of novels out there, is the backstory was it this novel in particular and these characters in particular based on the fact that you wanted to write about abortion as a particular subject, or do you always get into your characters and then you just inhabit them like that? I mean, is it that sort of sweeping across the decades thing specific to this particular work, or
That's something I never think of my work that way. I think this is my 7th book, and I think that is typical for me, I suppose. It's just not possible to write a well-developed character unless you know where they came from. You have to know about their parents. You have to know about their childhoods. You have to know, all that history that makes a person who they are. You can't do it any other way, really. If you're going to write well-developed characters, you need to know the past. And when I start writing, probably the first 6 months of writing a novel, I'm not writing chapters of the novel. I'm writing about the characters. I'm writing about the novel. So by the time I'm writing chapter 1, I already know a lot about these people. And a lot of that will never appear in the book. I know a lot about all 4 of these characters that didn't make it into the novel. And that's typical for me. I don't really know another way to do it. So yeah, it's kind of like you want to know the characters as well as you know your own family. And why do you know your family that well? Well, you know the whole story.
I love that. So it makes me wonder, like, do you write more than one book at a time? Like, does a character come to you and you kind of write them and they end up in a different story, or is it focused on one story at a time?
No, I can only do one thing at a time. I know writers who do that. I know people who work on 2 books at once and sort of toggle between them. I've never been able to do that. I can't even read 2 books at once. Never mind write 2. It's just, my mind is not wired that way.
Yeah, I have trouble with that as well. There is another pre-submitted question from Anne-Marie Cunningham, and she wondered if you thought you might write about medical abortion.
Well, medical abortion does come up in the novel. Some of the patients at this clinic have medical abortion. Some of them have what is called surgical abortion. So, it doesn't really change it in terms of Claudia's work. As a counselor, she talks them through both procedures and they make a choice which they're going to do. So some of these patients do end up having medical abortions. But because Claudia is a counselor, I'm focusing on the counseling experience that they have with her. After they leave her office, they may elect to do a medical abortion or surgical abortion. It's in terms of Claudia's work, it doesn't really make a difference.
Right. So just jumping back to the characters and the character development, there is another reader question that says, your affection for these characters, particularly Claudia and Deb, caused me to feel a deep affection, a powerful jolt for my loved ones and in general. I'm grateful for that takeaway, which was deep. Was providing those jolts of affection and love one of your goals?
No, it's not a goal. I guess it's something I feel. And if a reader feels it also, then I feel like I've communicated something. But really so central to this book is Claudia's relationship with her mother. And when the story opens, her mother's already dead. And so it's the experience of grief in a certain way. It's a couple years after her mother's death, but she's still very marked by it. And her emotional state during this story has everything to do with losing her mother. And, that's such a universal experience. We've all either lost a parent or we will. And, it's something that in Claudia that is so recognizably human, that I feel for her. And I'm glad that readers do too.
The next question, I think that this might be a broader question about Claudia and her relationship with her e-boyfriends. So the reader wants to know why you included the guy from Andover, because he just seemed to disappear. I think maybe that's referring to Stuart, maybe?
Yes. Yeah. Well, there's always a Stuart in Claudia's life. And if it weren't this particular Stuart, it would be a Stuart with a different name. And so it was really, he was included because that's part of the way her life is structured. She has these relationships for a period of time, but she only gets so close to these guys. She'll date them probably 6 to 12 months, and then that will end, and she will meet another e-boyfriend and date him for 6 to 12 months. And so it's actually a not unusual a way to organize your social life. And certainly I know lots of people who do date this way. It's,
Right.
It is a function of modern life.
I did love that her ex-husband, Phil, is that his name? What he sort of was like her touchstone, though. I liked how he just kind of came back every once in a while when she seemed to need somebody to just, and checking on her and making sure, he was kind of that constant thing that knew her from struggles that she had previously through, what she was doing now. I enjoyed that as a relationship as well.
Phil, he's family to her. And even though they were married for a very short time, a very long time ago, marriage makes families, and in all different sorts of ways. And even though, Claudia and Phil didn't stay together, they didn't have children, they still became family in a way that kind of sneaks up on you in marriage.
Yeah. There's a comment. I think this is more of a comment and maybe a direction we could go in, but there's a reader who was impressed with your attention to detail and went so far as to look up the Ash Wednesday in February. I think that was pretty early for Ash Wednesday, if I remember correctly, just to find out if that was really accurate. And apparently you did that spot on. Lots of
there's
detail.
Always one reader who will do that. And I love those readers. I love those people. They keep you honest as a writer. And yeah, it was very important that be right, because 2015 is a time that happened, and you have to deal with it as it was. In terms of the weather of that year, like none of that is invented, and the calendar and where the holidays fall and all of that. Yeah, that's always part of building a novel for me anyway.
Yeah. Let's see. I'm just trying to make sure I didn't miss the last question there. Yep, that was the detail question. Another thing that I wondered about was, I think I touched on it a little bit before. I mean, the story is set specifically in New England, but it kind of has a more universal feeling. I mean, you don't have to be a New Englander to enjoy this story. And so I just wondered, and of course there are abortion clinics all over the country, not just in New England. So was it specifically your connection to New England that meant the story felt like it needed to take place there, or was it specifically that year 2015 with all the snowstorms? What was the thing that made it feel like it needed to be set in New England for you?
It isn't one thing. Those are a couple of the factors, certainly, but there's a more important reason. In the first scene of the book, when Claudia is looking out counting the protesters, it's Ash Wednesday, and it's a very Catholic group, and that is Boston. Boston is arguably the most Catholic city in America. I wrote an earlier novel, my novel Faith, which was published in 2011, which was also set in Boston, that focuses on a priest who is accused of molesting a child in his parish. That was a novel that could only have happened in Boston. Of course, the Boston Globe broke this clergy sex abuse story here, and of any Catholic city in America, Boston has probably felt the fallout of it hardest. Mercy Street is very much set in Boston as kind of a post-Catholic city. And what I mean by that is there's still loads of Catholics in Boston, but they are the worse for wear. Church attendance in Boston has plummeted. It has never come back up. Loads of churches have closed. It's not the only archdiocese in America where that has happened, but it has happened in a very pronounced way here. And it is not accidental that this novel is set in Boston. I find it very interesting that the protest outside the clinic was led by Catholic priests and brothers, even at the point where the church's moral authority on sexual matters is dubious at best. And in fact, in that first scene, Claudia is talking with her coworker Mary Fahey, who is still practicing Catholic, and in fact has the Ash Wednesday ashes on her forehead. She's been to church just that morning, and yet she works as a nurse in this clinic that does abortions. And I think that's significant and interesting. There are loads of Catholics who are conflicted about abortion, and there are loads of Catholics who are actually pro-choice, like that character Mary Fahey. And so setting the story in Boston was a very conscious choice.
So we actually have another question here from Kate True in Boston. She says she really loved the novel and found it so rich and timely. And she says, thank you. I'm wondering if you were influenced by other novels or writers in writing Mercy Street. And also, are there any plans to turn this story into a movie? It seems very filmic to me.
Well, in terms of being influenced, yes, certainly. We learn to write by reading other writers. And for every novel I've ever written, there are 2 or 3 novels that really informed it and helped me figure out how to write it. But it was striking to me when I started writing this novel, nobody ever writes about abortion. I mean, this isn't a novel about abortion by any means, but this clinic is very central to the novel. And when I started writing it, I did some looking around, and I was stunned that I couldn't find any other novel that really deals with abortion in the current era. There are these kind of dystopic, futuristic novels like The Handmaid's Tale, say, which is also set in Boston, that deal with the question of abortion in a time that is not our own, under different circumstances. There was Leni Zumas's novel Red Clocks, which is wonderful, but it is not set. It's not a realistic novel. They're all somewhat speculative. And I think the reason for that is it's just a really hard thing to write about. If there is any such thing as a third rail topic in American culture, abortion is it. It's, everybody has an opinion about abortion. It's an incredibly divisive subject. And once I got into the writing of this, I sort of understood why nobody has ever tackled it before, because I really did have this feeling like I am doing cartwheels down the third rail here. And I'm sure to offend people as I go. I'm sure to offend people who have read my books in the past, who have strong feelings about abortion. But, as a novelist, you have to write what you feel most strongly.
Yeah.
And at the time I was writing this novel, it was the thing I felt most strongly. But I did have this very precarious feeling in writing it. It's lots and lots of people are alienated by this subject. And yet I find it incredibly important and meaningful. And I'm glad I wrote the book.
So it's interesting that you say that, because while I was reading the book, I was actually comparing it to Joyce Carol Oates wrote a book called American Martyrs.
Yeah.
And I was reading it, and that was in my mind. But the biggest difference that I could think of was not that there was not a sense of empathy for the characters in American Martyrs, but I didn't feel, I mean, and they were very well developed. I just didn't get that same feeling of being able to inhabit their own minds, right? Like, or maybe it's because there was no, I didn't feel like there was humor in that novel at all. So really it was just kind of terrifying to read. And maybe that's why the connection, it was very hard to like get into their heads, because it was kind of just a place like you didn't want to be. But the way that Mercy Street is written, I mean, even Victor, who is really just quite abhorrent, right? Like it just, you didn't want to be in there, but there was, there was enough like real just kind of understanding that, there's humor and there's more sensitivity in dealing with him. I mean, even to the point of, I kind of feel like it was almost like his journey, and maybe all of their journeys kind of went along with the season, right? There was all this snow and all this cold and all this frenzy of weather, and then the spring came and the thaw happened. Like, after Victor got in his car accident, he didn't seem quite as dedicated any longer to, his previous misogynistic self and his, white supremacy, and he just kind of took it to the sofa, I guess, and left it there. It was interesting, just the way that I felt like he just kind of like he maybe faded away a little bit into nothing, right? His website got taken down, and he just sort of like disappeared into nowhere. Let's see, we have a few more questions. So another anonymous question. Oh, another reader is mentioning Spark of Light, Jodi Picoult, her novel there that also, I guess, was set in an abortion clinic. Oh, and here's a good question from another anonymous attendee. What's next?
Well, there will be another novel, but I've never talked about work in progress, never. It makes me nervous. And, even, I mean, my agent, my editor, they don't know what I'm going to write next. I really do keep it really close until it's fully.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I guess that seems to make sense, just given on how you live with your characters and develop them before you actually start writing the book itself.
Casey, part of it is, once I've spoken about something, it sort of shuts down my imagination. Once I've said the book is this and the characters are like this, once I've said it out loud to anybody, then I almost can't imagine it any other way. Yeah. And so I'm really hesitant to talk about it because it's almost determinative in a way. So yeah. I need to sort of stumble around with it in the dark for a few years before I let anybody know what I'm doing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm getting a little note here that I'm giving out a 5-minute warning. I'm just looking through the questions here one more time. There's last question here from Nancy. Did you struggle about whether to have Claudia? Well, I guess we've already covered this, so it's not quite a spoiler, but did you struggle with the ending and Claudia and her decision, or was that always clear to you that was going to happen?
No, it wasn't clear to me. I always struggle with every ending. I know lots of writers who, mostly like mystery writers, genre writers, they're very disciplined about outlining and figuring out the whole story before they sit down to write. I could never do that. For me, the ending is very suspenseful. In the first draft of it, I have no idea where the story is going to go. And it's really, the story becomes a story in the process of writing it. It's not something I figure out ahead of time. So as I get to know the character better and live with the character longer, I start to understand, how she would behave in different circumstances. But at the beginning, when I first start writing, I just don't know her that well. And so if I were to say, this is how the story is going to end, this is what she's going to do, I could very easily be wrong because I've just met her, so it's after I've lived with the characters for a couple of years and been writing on it for a couple of years, then the ending becomes clear to me, but really not until then.
Yeah. I don't see any other questions right now. One question that I have, just because it's a question I love when I'm reading articles or seeing things by other authors. So what do you read while you're writing, or do you take a break in between your writing to read things? As to how does your TBR pile go?
I never stop reading. I think of reading as my food. And as a writer, I think when you stop reading, you stop growing. You need to read books that remind you what the point is, like why you wanted to do this in the first place. So I'm always reading something. Although in the first draft, when I'm getting the first pages down, I have to be careful about what I read, because it would be very easy to unconsciously mimic what I'm writing. Writers are great mimics. That's how we learn how to do it, from reading. So I don't like to read anything that is too close in subject or in style to what I'm writing. I don't read contemporary fiction in that first year and a half of writing a novel. I can read nonfiction, I can read poetry, I can read in French, I can read 19th century stuff that there is no danger of me mimicking. But I only let myself read contemporary novels when I'm in the sort of final draft and I'm just revising and revising. Or like right now, when a book has just been published and I'm promoting it, this is like that great moment where I can read whatever I want, and it's thrilling.
So what are you reading?
So I just started this morning the Claire Keegan novel, Small Things Like These. God, it's so good. It's a very short novel, and I'm consciously reading slowly because I don't want to run out of book.
Oh,
So
I love that.
You can almost read it in one sitting. It's really, I guess you could sort of call it a novella. It's tiny, but I'm stretching it a little bit so I can get another day out of it. It's just magical.
It's nice. So there was one last comment in the Q&A. Mary, I just want to get her name right. Marianne Gopinski, and she's just commenting that she grew up in the area in Western Pennsylvania that you're from, and now she lives in the Boston area. So the geographical influences she definitely connected with, and she wanted to say that she's read all of your books and she loved everyone. Thank you. Yeah, so it's 6:45. I don't know if that means we are wrapping up 6:46, or I'm looking to see if there's any more chat things coming up or comments or questions coming up, but I don't see any. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Casey. My pleasure.
Yeah,
thanks really everyone for tuning in.
Yeah, and thanks for all the great questions that really kept us going. I had a handful, but then the really good ones started pouring in. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you.